Our species has a history of violence, and I'm going to speak to you about it tonight, covering violence in the past, the present, and I'll say a bit about the future. The most obvious fact about violence in the past is that there was much more of it. There have been at least 6 major declines of violence in human history. This evening, I'm going to walk you through each one of them, trying to identify their immediate causes, that is, historical events of that particular era. But then I'll also try to tie them together in terms of their ultimate causes, namely components of human nature interacting with historical circumstances. The first decline of violence I call the pacification process. Until around 6,000 years ago, humans everywhere lived in anarchy without central government. What was life like in this state of nature? This is a question that thinkers have pondered literally for centuries. In 1651, Thomas Hobbes famously wrote that in a state of nature, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. A century later, Jean-Jacques Rousseau countered that nothing can be more gentle than man in his primitive state, one of the most famous citizens of this country. Now, it turns out that neither of these men had any idea what life was like in a state of anarchy. They were speculating from the armchair. But today we can do better because there are a number of sources of evidence on rates of violence in non-state societies. And I'll just mention one of them, forensic archaeology. You can think of this as CSI Paleolithic. Namely, what proportion of prehistoric skeletons show signs of violent trauma, such as bashed-in skulls, decapitations, arrowheads embedded in bones, and mummies found with ropes around their necks. I found 20 estimates from the archaeological literature, and as you can see, they span quite a range, but they average out to 15%. 15% of prehistoric skeletons show signs of violent trauma. Is that a big number or a small number? Well, let's compare it to the counterpart from modern civilizations, and I'll even stack the deck against modernity by picking a couple of particularly violent times, such as the 20th century. The corresponding figure for the percentage of deaths due to warfare in Europe and the United States in the 20th century is 0.6%. If you try to set an upper bound on the highest rate of violence that's justified by the evidence, aggregating direct deaths from war, indirect deaths from starvation and disease in the wake of war, genocides and man-made famines, then you get a rate of 3% for the entire world for the 20th century. And the corresponding figure for the world in the 21st century is invisible. The bar is less than 1 pixel high at a rate of 0.03%. So not to put too fine a point on it, but when it comes to violence in a state of nature, Hobbes was right, Rousseau was wrong. The immediate cause appears to be the rise and expansion of states, leading to the various paxes that history students have to memorize, the Pax Romana, Pax Islamica, Pax Hispanica, and so on. Basically, when a state exerts hegemony over a territory, one of the first things they try to do is stamp out the endemic raiding and feuding, not because the early kings and emperors had a benevolent interest in the welfare of their citizens, but rather because tribal raiding and feuding is a nuisance to imperial overlords who would just as soon keep the people alive to supply them with taxes and soldiers and slaves. So just as a farmer has an interest in preventing his livestock from killing each other, he doesn't really care what they're fighting about, and it's just a dead loss to him. So the early emperors tried to stamp out tribal raiding and feuding in their territories. The second decline of violence can be appreciated by examining this woodcut showing a typical day in the life in the European Middle Ages. And the process that brought this mayhem out of control has been called the civilizing process. Now, it turns out that in many parts of Europe, data on homicide go back 800 years, and historical criminologists have gathered them and plotted them over time. So here you see a number of estimates of homicide rates in England from the year 1200 to the year 2000, plotted on a logarithmic scale from 1/10 of a homicide per 100,000 per year to 1 to 10 to 100. As you can see, there's been a massive decline in the rate of English homicide, such that a contemporary Englishman has about 1/35 the chance of being murdered compared to his medieval ancestors. This is true not just in England, but in every European country for which data are available. Here you see Italy, Netherlands, England, Scandinavia, and of course Germany and Switzerland. Here we have an average of those 5 regions showing the decline. And for the sake of comparison, I've also shown the rate for the non-state societies that you saw in the graph for the pacification process. This gap here is what I call the pacification process, and then this further decline, the civilizing process. The name comes from a famous book by the German sociologist Norbert Elias, who argued that during the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity, there was a consolidation of central states and kingdoms out of the medieval patchwork of baronies and duchies and principalities. With it, criminal justice was nationalized, and the constant feuding and brigandage and warlording of the medieval knights gave way to the king's justice. Also, during this era, there was a growing infrastructure of commerce. There were financial instruments like money and contracts, and an enhanced physical infrastructure of commerce that made it easier to exchange goods and services, such as improvements in roads and carts and instruments of timekeeping. As a result, zero-sum plunder began to give way to positive-sum trade, and that's a theme that I will refer to later in the lecture. The third historic decline of violence can be appreciated by considering some of the ways in which the early kings and emperors kept law and order within their borders, namely sadistic forms of corporal and capital punishment, such as breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, clawing with iron hooks, sawing in half, and impalement. But in a development that's been called the humanitarian revolution, country after country abolished the use of torture as a form of criminal punishment in a wave of abolition centered in the 18th century, which includes the famous prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment in the United States, which took place right in the middle of this wave. That is the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution. Also abolished during the humanitarian revolution was the profligate use of the death penalty for non-lethal crimes. In 18th century England, there were 222 capital offenses on the law books, including poaching, counterfeiting, robbing a rabbit warren, being in the company of gypsies, and strong evidence of malice in a child 7 to 14 years of age. By 1861, the number of capital crimes had been reduced to 4. Now, the death penalty itself, of course, has been abolished in most European countries, most Western countries. Here you have a timeline for the abolition of capital punishment in Europe. Most of the abolitions took place actually in the 20th century, but the blue timeline, which shows the number of European countries that actually execute people, shows that before politicians got around to striking capital punishment from the law books, their fellow citizens had lost their taste for putting people to death. And on average, 50 years elapsed between the actual execution in a country and the time that it was formally abolished. Now, the United States is, in this, and in fact in many of the trends that I'll talk about this evening, an outlier in this process. Capital punishment continues to exist in the United States, but even in the United States, capital punishment is a shadow of its former self. This graph plots the per capita execution rate in the United States from colonial times in 1625 to the year, the first decade of the 21st century. And you can see there's been a massive decline in the execution rate. Nowadays, perhaps 40 people are put to death every year, a number that's been declining in a country that has more than 15,000 homicides per year. Also abolished during this period were witch hunts, religious persecution, such as burning heretics, dueling among men of honor, blood sports like bear baiting, debtors' prisons, and most famously of all, slavery. Slavery used to be legal everywhere on earth. no one seemed to think there was anything wrong with it. The Bible had no problem with slavery. So-called democratic Athens had approximately a third of its citizens as slaves. But then, beginning in the 18th century, there was a trickle of abolitions that then grew into a wave, culminating in 1980 when Mauritania became the last country to abolish legal slavery, which means that for 35 years we've been living through an unprecedented period in human history in which slavery has not been legal anywhere on earth. What were the immediate causes of the humanitarian revolution? Well, it would be natural to guess, particularly in an audience of economists, that it was the rise of affluence. That as one's own life becomes more pleasant and longer and healthier, perhaps you put a higher value on life in general, including the life of others. I think this is plausible as a general explanation, but not for the humanitarian reforms of the Enlightenment, because the timing is wrong. Economic historians tell us that the growth in affluence really began with the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, but most of the reforms we've been talking about occurred in the 18th century when per capita income barely increased at all. Of all of the possible predictors, I've only found one that shows some, or of all the exogenous factors, I've only found one that at least showed an increase before the events we're trying to explain. And that is printing and literacy. Before the 18th century, there was a 25-fold increase in the economic efficiency in producing a book. This was put into practice, and there was during the 18th century, an exponential increase in the number of books published per decade, a kind of early version of Moore's Law. And in the 18th century, for the first time, a majority of Englishmen could read those books. Now, why should literacy matter? Well, this era goes by another name. It's also called the Enlightenment because it was the era in which knowledge began to replace superstition and ignorance. And it's at least plausible that a literate and educated populace is less likely to believe, for example, that Jews poison the wells, that heretics go to hell, that epidemics and crop failures are caused by witchcraft, that children are possessed by the devil, which has to be beaten out of them, that Africans are brutish and fit only for slavery, the kings are granted a divine right to rule, and so on. And this could undermine many rationales for institutionalized violence. As Voltaire said during this era, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Also, literacy is a technology of cosmopolitanism, of the mixing of peoples and ideas. And there is evidence that when people consume more fiction, more drama, more history, more journalism, they start to exercise their ability to inhabit other people's minds, to see what the world looks like from their point of view. And that seems to expand their circle of empathy and decrease their taste for cruelty. 4 and 5, there have been 2 declines in war in history. The first can be appreciated by taking a look at this graph, which plots the rate of death from war in the 20th century extending into the first decade of the 21st. There's no doubt that there were 2 horrific spikes of bloodletting centered on the 2 world wars. But many of us grew up with the prediction that it was only a matter of time before this series would continue and that we would come to witness a World War III between the United States and the Soviet Union, which would be a nuclear war and would dwarf even the casualties from World War II. That did not take place, and instead we have this kind of wrinkled carpet along the floor for the years since 1945. This is a development that historians call the Long Peace, referring to the fact that since 1946, there's been a historically unprecedented decline in interstate war. That is, a war with a government on each side. In fact, the most interesting statistics from this period are 0. There were no wars between the United States and the Soviet Union until the Soviet Union went out of existence. No nuclear weapon has been used since Nagasaki. There have been no wars between any 2 great powers since the end of the Korean War in 1953. No wars between any 2 Western European countries, a fact that might almost seem kind of banal and obvious to some of the younger people in the audience. They might be forgiven for thinking, well, big deal, of course, France and Germany would never go to war. But needless to say, this is a historically unusual set of affairs. Before 1945, Western European countries alone started 2 new wars a year for 600 years. As of 1946, that went to 0. And there have been no wars between developed countries. Nowadays, we tend to think of wars as occurring in some of the poorer and more backward parts of the world. But for most of human history, it was the big, rich, advanced, developed states that were constantly at each other's throats. And because big, rich countries can afford big, destructive armies, it was these wars that did the most damage. In a development that I call the new peace, the long peace is beginning to spread to more and more of the world. So since the end of the Cold War around 1990, globally, there have been fewer wars of all kinds, that is, including civil wars and wars between poor countries, and there's a lower rate of death from war overall. Again, I'll show that to you in a graph. This plots the rate of death in 4 categories of war from 1946 to 2008, and it's a stacked layer graph. So the first layer consists of colonial wars, which petered out to 0 in the 1970s as European countries divested themselves of their overseas empires. Here we have the rate of death from interstate wars, that is country against country, which shows spikes in the era of the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Iran-Iraq War. Here we have the rate of death from internal civil wars and from civil wars with outside intervention. So the world has gone through something of a roller coaster, but in the first decade of the 21st century, we see a thin laminate of layers showing an unprecedentedly low rate of death from all wars combined. What were the immediate causes of the long peace and the new peace? Well, more than 200 years ago, Immanuel Kant suggested in his essay Perpetual Peace that democracy, trade, and an international community all disincentivized leaders from dragging their countries into stupid wars. And there is some evidence for Kant's conjecture. All 3 of these factors increased in the second half of the 20th century. And a heroic regression analysis by John O'Neill and Bruce Russett showed that all of them are statistical predictors of peace going forward, holding all other factors constant. Also, there have been changing attitudes toward war, in addition to these structural factors. War used to be considered heroic, glorious, thrilling, and manly. Now it's more likely to be considered stupid, wasteful, repulsive, and cruel. There are changing international norms about war, what respectable, decent nations do and don't do. Previously, war was considered the continuation of policy by other means, in the famous words of von Clausewitz. It's no longer considered a legitimate option among respectable nation states. There's also a norm that states are immortal. That is, you can't swallow another country. And indeed, since the founding of the United Nations, no member state has gone out of existence through conquest. And that borders, for better or worse, are grandfathered in. No matter how irrational the borders are, they, by default, stay put. A norm that, needless to say, has been threatened over the last year or two. Finally, there are the rights revolutions, the targeting of violence on smaller scales against vulnerable sectors of the population, such as racial minorities, women, children, homosexuals, and animals. Just to give you a taste of some of these revolutions, the Civil Rights Revolution put an end to the practice of lynching in the United States. In the late 19th century, there were 150 lynchings a year, that's 3 a week. By the 1950s, that had fallen to 0. And there's been a steady decrease in hate crimes against African Americans since they were first recorded by the FBI. The women's rights revolution has seen an 80% decline in the rate of rape since data were first kept by the FBI in the 1970s. A similarly precipitous decline in the rate of domestic violence, particularly with female victims, and declines in the rate of uxoricide and mariticide, that is, the murder of wives and husbands, respectively. In fact, the decline for boyfriends and husbands has been even more steep than the decline for wives and girlfriends, showing that the women's rights revolution has been very, very good for husbands. The children's rights revolution has seen a decline in corporal punishment, that is the use of strapping and paddling, at least in American schools, where state after state has abolished it. There's been a decline in the acceptability of spanking in every Western country for which we have public opinion polls from the 1950s to 2000. Declines, at least in the United States, in both physical and sexual abuse of children, and declines in school violence, such as fights and non-fatal crimes. The gay rights revolution has seen a worldwide movement to decriminalize homosexuality. Here you have a timeline from 1780 to 2000 of states, worldwide states that have decriminalized homosexuality, and American states, which now stands at 50 out of 50, thanks to a Supreme Court ruling. Finally, the animal rights revolution has seen a decline in hunting, an increase in vegetarianism, and a steep decline in the number of motion pictures in which animals were harmed. Well, all this raises the question, why has violence declined on so many scales of time and magnitude? And in my book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Gewalt was the German title, I suggested that it comes from an interaction between human nature, which I don't think has changed, and human history. Namely, that human nature comprises a number of motives for violence and a number of motives that counteract violence, what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, and that historical circumstances increasingly favor our peaceable inclinations, our better angels. Now, I said there were motives for violence. I don't believe that there is a single neurobiological entity called aggression or instinct for violence, but that people commit violence for very different reasons. The most straightforward is sheer exploitation or predation, the harming of a person that happens to be an obstacle on the path to something that you want. And this includes forms of violence such as rape, plunder, conquest, and the elimination of rivals. A very different motive is the drive for dominance, the urge among individuals to climb the pecking order and become alpha male. And there's a corresponding competition among groups for ethnic, racial, national, or religious supremacy. There's revenge or moralistic violence, perhaps the most destructive category of violence of all, in which people feel that not only are they permitted, but they are obligated to harm someone who has committed what they consider to be a moral infraction, giving us vendettas, rough justice, and cruel punishments. And then there are ideologies that justify violence, particularly utopian ideologies, including militant religions, nationalism, Nazism, and communism, which justify violence by a kind of cost-benefit analysis. If you have a vision for a world that will be perfect forever, well, how much violence are you justified in expending to bring that vision to Earth? Well, as much as you want. You're always ahead. Also, what do you do with people who have heard your vision for a utopia, but just don't get with the program, but stand in your way? How evil are they? Well, according to this calculus, they are arbitrarily evil, and they ought to be punished as needed. As in the old expression in the Soviet Union, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, neglecting the fact that human beings are not eggs. Well, this sounds pretty depressing, but what do we have on the other side to counteract these motives for violence? What are the better angels of our nature? Well, there's self-control, the ability to anticipate the consequences of our behavior and inhibit our violent impulses. There's empathy, the ability to feel others' pain. There's a moral sense, a set of norms and taboos that govern just what you feel you may or may not do as a respectable person or country. And reason, the use of cognitive processes to engage in objective, detached analysis. And I've argued that over the course of history, our institutions and norms increasingly are designed to bring out our better angels, such as democratic government, which prevents people from preying on each other without preying on the people itself, such as commerce, which makes it cheaper to buy things than steal them, and makes other people more valuable alive than dead. You don't kill your customers, you don't kill your debtors. The rise of media, including journalism, movies, and fiction, that expand our circle of empathy by making it easy to imagine other people's lives and therefore reduce the temptation to demonize or dehumanize them. And the rise of education and expertise, which allows us to treat violence as a problem to be solved rather than as a contest to be won. Okay, let me switch now to violence in the present. Now, this does not seem to be a particularly auspicious time to write about the historical decline of violence. Just in the past few years, we've seen the rise of Daesh, wars in Ukraine, riots in American streets following the shooting of unarmed African Americans by a white policeman, a number of school shootings, again in the United States, and of course the horrendous hunting of Cecil the lion by a dentist in Zimbabwe. So this leads to the frequently asked question, has the decline of violence reversed since Better Angels was sent to press in 2010? Well, there's one way not to answer the question, and that is to read the news. Because the news is a systematically misleading way to understand the world, as we heard in the session on terrorism. How does the human mind intuitively assess risk? The famous psychologists, claimed by economists now as behavioral economists, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for this work, showed that the major way that the human mind assesses risk and danger is by a mental shortcut called the availability heuristic. Namely, the easier it is to imagine or remember an example, the more likely that kind of event is estimated to be. And that's why we fear plane crashes, shark attacks, and nuclear accidents, when we really should fear car crashes, falling down the stairs, and using a portable generator indoors, which are far more likely to kill us. So what happens when the availability heuristic is fed by the news? Well, news consists of stuff that happens. It doesn't consist of stuff that doesn't happen. You never see a reporter reporting live in front of a school that has not had a shooting that day, or a country that has not had a war or a terrorist attack. And also there's even some degree of deliberate distortion in the programming of at least television news, which famously works by the watchword, if it bleeds, it leads. You combine the availability heuristic with the nature of news, and you get the impression that the world is more dangerous than it ever has been, and it always has been more dangerous than it ever has been. The cure for both the cognitive and journalistic biases, of course, consists of data, plotting the number of bad things that happen as a proportion of the number of opportunities, and seeing whether that proportion has changed over time. So, like the Godfather, I like to get my bad news right away. And I'll start with the bad news. Namely, there is one trend in violence that has reversed since the Better Angels was sent to the press, and that is the number of wars. So here, in the following graphs, I'm going to use a purple line to show the when the books were closed on the Better Angels of Our Nature, and the trends since then give us a kind of picture of whether the trends that I documented 5 years ago were flukes or whether they've continued in the same direction. So in the case of civil wars, you can see that there has been a reversal since the Better Angels was printed. This is not a journalistic illusion. This really has taken place. Although the graph also shows that at least so far, it's really only brought us back to where the world was in 2001 and nowhere near the peaks that the world reached in the 1980s and 1990s. At the worst point, the world had 26 wars going on at the same time. That fell for a couple of years to 4. Now it's back up to 11. And if you look at the human toll from these wars, that is the rate of battle deaths, again, with the purple line showing the point at which the data sets were closed on the Better Angels of Our Nature, you can see that there has been something of an uptick since then. Although, again, putting it into perspective, it only takes us back approximately to the year 2000. It's not even in the same ballpark as the rates of death in war in earlier decades. Why have civil wars increased in the past 3 years? Well, to put it only a little too crudely, it's mainly because of jihad and Putin. Of the 11 ongoing wars right now, 8 of them have radical jihadist forces on one side, and additional 2 are the civil wars in Ukraine. The 11th is the war in South Sudan, but 10 out of the 11 can be attributed to these causes. Well, now for the good news, and the good news is that that's the only bad news. That is, every other one of the trends that I have mentioned has stayed put or continued in the same direction. And we may as well begin once again with war. Here I've reproduced that graph for all wars, but if you break out the number of interstate wars, that is country against country, you see that it continues to be pinned to the floor at 0. Though there has been much publicity about a backsliding of democracy with salient examples like Venezuela and Turkey and Russia, overall, the world has never been more democratic, and the total democracy score continues to increase. The world's autocracy score continues to decrease. Homicide kills far more people than wars, anywhere from 5 to 10 times as many, and the rate of homicide appears to be in decline. Here we have a graph for the United States, where the great American homicide decline beginning in the 1990s actually got a second wind in 2007 and declined even further. And as best we can tell, the rate of homicide across the world seems to be in decline. The death penalty is on death row. I mentioned that the United States is a backward country as far as in the context of other Western democracies in continuing to execute people. But since 2007, 7 American states have abolished the death penalty, including 2 since Better Angels of Our Nature was written. And 30 states have not executed anyone in the past 5 years. Here we see that the rate of execution continues to decline in the United States, and many experts are predicting that it will disappear altogether. This seems to be a global trend. Here I'm plotting the number of countries that have abolished capital punishment in reality or on the law books, and as you can see, that has continued to increase since the Better Angels was published. Hate crimes in the United States, despite the publicity about assaults on African Americans, continues to be in decline, as are other categories of hate crimes. Violence against women continues to fall, both intimate partner violence, that is what used to be called wife beating, and rape and sexual assault. Violence against children continues to be in decline. Here we have a graph of violent victimization at school, physical abuse by caregivers, and sexual abuse, all continuing to fall. Despite, once again, some highly publicized reversals in Uganda and other African countries, the worldwide trend continues to be toward the decriminalization of homosexuality. Finally, what about Cecil the lion? Well, in the United States, the popularity of hunting continues to decline, and the United States is one of the most hunter-friendly countries. So to sum up recent trends in violence, radical Islamists and Putin have erased 14 of the last 24 years of progress in the decline of civil war, but all other declines have persisted or continued. Interstate war, democracy, homicide, capital punishment, violence against women, violence against children, violence against homosexuals, and violence against animals. Let me turn now for a couple of minutes to the future of violence. Now, it's been said that social scientists should never try to predict the future. We have enough trouble predicting the past. And speaking of angels, there is an expression that fools rush in where angels fear to tread. So I will say right now that I have no idea what the future of violence will be, and neither does anyone else in this room. But here are some thoughts that are at least informed by past and present data. An important observation is some forms of violence, once abolished, more or less stay abolished. Human sacrifice being a good example. I don't think we are going to restore the age-old process of throwing virgins into volcanoes to placate angry gods anytime soon. That's a prediction that I'm willing to stick with. Cannibalism used to be widespread across human societies, and it seems to be gone. Eunuchism, I don't think is going to make a comeback. Chattel slavery, debtors' prisons, public torture executions. Now, this at least introduces us to the idea that when you can draw a clear boundary around a human practice, there are historical precedents for it being abolished more or less once and for all. So it's possible that there are other categories that could follow that path, such as interstate war. Again, I'm distinguishing it very sharply now from civil war. That is, one country declaring war against another country appears to be obsolescent, and since there are only 190 or so players that all have to agree that interstate war is a bad idea, it's at least not inconceivable, I don't think it's romantic or utopian, to think that it could go the way of chattel slavery. I think forms of violent punishment could, in the life of our children, be eliminated. It's been estimated that if current trends on the abolition of capital punishment continue, admittedly a big if, the world will be free of capital punishment in 11 years. Corporal punishment, likewise. And possibly punishment of victimless acts. We're seeing that, as I mentioned, the decriminalization of homosexuality. It's not inconceivable that that could be like slavery abolished worldwide. And we're starting to see trends for drug possession and even prostitution. There are other categories of violence that certainly will not disappear, but where we might expect continuing quantitative declines. Homicide and other violent crimes within effective states. About a year ago, I attended a meeting at the University of Cambridge in which the world's leading criminologists evaluated the very strong possibility that global rates of homicide could be brought down by 50% within the next 30 years. It was not adopted as a new Millennium Development Goal, but it actually is quite a feasible one. Violence against women globally has been targeted by a number of international agreements, and we know that in the past, even though many international agreements have been toothless, they often can carry the day, such as the abolition of the slave trade, of piracy, of privateering, of commercial whaling, of atmospheric nuclear testing. So domestic violence and rape might indeed be reduced. And violence against children globally, there have been a number of UN and international resolutions to change norms and bring that down. Then there are some categories of violence which are unlikely to decrease anytime soon. I don't think we're going to see much of a reduction in civil wars or in deaths from civil wars. And the uptick of the last 3 years, I should mention, by the way, that the vast majority of the uptick in the rate of death from civil wars is due to one civil war, namely the one in Syria. The president of the Peace Research Institute of Oslo characterized the recent upturn as neither a blip nor a trend. And I think that's right. I don't think it's going to come back down within the next few years, but nor do I think that we're going to see a reversal back to the levels of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. On the other hand, many of the long-term economic and demographic trends are positive. The fact that the world is getting richer, that global extreme poverty is declining, the fact that the world is getting older, that birth rates are in decline, including, as a big surprise, in Africa and Islamic countries. The fact that rates of education are increasing, all of these are at least long-term statistical predictors of a lower risk of civil war. I don't think human rights in the Islamic world are going to do a U-turn anytime soon. On the other hand, I can't help but inject one positive note. The abolition of slavery has an interesting trajectory. It was first abolished in Northern and Western European countries, then in the Northern American states, then the Southern American states, then in Latin America and Asia, with Islamic countries pulling up the rear. Saudi Arabia and Yemen only abolished slavery in 1962, and as I mentioned, Mauritania in 1980. Obviously one can't expect that to be replicated, but it is not inconceivable that global norms shifts might follow a similar trajectory, and that it's not inconceivable that the pent-up demand for women's rights and other human rights, even in the Islamic world, will eventually result in changes there. I also don't think we're going to see a decline in cheap, low-death, high-publicity violence, and again, this echoes what we heard in the session on terrorism earlier this afternoon. Namely, terrorism is a way of gathering massive amounts of publicity with a relatively small outlay of violence. Deaths from terrorism are kind of in the rounding error of most kinds of violence, as are rampage shootings, such as are popular in American high schools and movie theaters. They're a guaranteed way to get your name in the headlines, even if you don't live to enjoy it. But their contribution to the overall rate of homicide is trifling. But it's an irresistible temptation to various people with grievances seeking publicity, and I expect that we are not going to see the end to them anytime soon. So the biggest question of all is, why has violence declined on so many scales of time and magnitude? That is there some common dynamic that has caused the violence reductions in the past, and at least which might be hoped to cause more violence reductions in the future? It just seems like too big a coincidence. There must be something deeper. My best guess is that violence is what the game theorists call a social dilemma. Namely, it's always tempting to an aggressor to exploit a victim, but of course it's ruinous to the victim, and the harm done to the victim exceeds the gain enjoyed by the aggressor. But since aggressors can become victims and vice versa, in the long run, everyone really would be better off if everyone could agree to abjure violence. The dilemma is, how do you get the other guy to refrain from violence at the same time as you do? Because if you beat your swords into plowshares, but the other guy keeps his swords as swords, then you could be in a world of trouble. It's not implausible to think that over the course of history, human experience and human ingenuity have gradually chipped away at this problem, just like we have gradually chipped away at other scourges of the human condition, like pestilence and hunger. And what the various violence reduction measures have in common is that they all increase the material, emotional, or cognitive incentives of all parties to avoid violence simultaneously, which suggests that violence reduction may be like other kinds of technological progress, not linear, not inexorable, but highly likely over the long run. And I think that these data call for a rehabilitation of the admittedly old-fashioned ideas of modernity and progress, not based on a generalized sunniness or optimism, but rather on which way the data seem to be going. And there's certainly cause for gratitude for the institutions of civilization and enlightenment that have made it possible. Thank you very much.
Stay here and monitor the audience that you can concentrate on. So thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. There's now room for questions. So I'm playing the monitor such that he can concentrate on the answers. Okay, there are 3 questions here. Ted, you go first, then you go second, and then Joachim.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed that. I had a specific data question. I was curious about, I know the battle deaths data, I've used some of that data myself. I was curious about which data you used, if you were able to consider it, on civilian deaths during war. I was trying to look at your plots for the Rwandan genocide in '94. I didn't see a spike. I was looking for the Congolese war where millions have died, and between '97 and 2002, I didn't see a spike. So I'm just wondering if there's certain classes of violence that were harder to get data on, or if you consider them maybe in the book but not in the talk. So I was curious about those specific African cases.
Yes, so there are, in these data, the data tend to separate out deaths from war, where there is a government force and some other organized force, and what's variously called one-sided violence or genocide, where there is an organized force that is killing unarmed civilians. Now, in the data that you saw, the battle deaths, those do include civilian deaths in wars, that is, people caught in the crossfire, or as they say, collateral damage. So it's not just soldiers, but these are all episodes in which you can identify 2 organized armed parties. There are separate data which I did not present tonight, but which are both in the book and which I have updated since the book went to press on one-sided violence. The Uppsala Conflict Data Project has data on one-sided violence going back to 1989, so it does include the Rwandan genocide, which kind of pokes up like a massive spike. And so, in fact, those data I usually plot logarithmically, because otherwise it just looks like a spike with a little wrinkle along the floor. And then I also have in the book less precise but longer span time series, one from University of Maryland, which goes back to 1955, another which is more kind of reasonable order of magnitude guesstimates for the entire 20th century. And so the overall trajectory of genocide or one-sided violence is there was a huge increase in the middle decades of the 20th century, including the Nazi genocide and Stalin and Imperial Japan. These data also include deaths, deliberate targeting of unarmed civilians in World War II, including by the Allied forces, such as the fire bombings of European and Japanese cities. And so that kind of dominates the data. And then there are other peaks for example, Cambodia and Rwanda. But even the Rwanda peak is a fraction of the death rate from the middle decades. Then for the more recent period, the graph looks much like the graph for war deaths, because many of the deaths in one-sided violence coincide with civil wars. So what it looks like is a spike for Rwanda, a smaller hump for Bosnia, then it kind of hugs the floor, and then there's a very small uptick in the last 3 years. So once again, it's going in the wrong direction, and I kind of glossed over that because it's very similar to civil wars and the causes overlap, namely ISIS and other kinds of violence against civilians. But it comes nowhere close to rates in the 1990s or even 1980s.
Okay, then there is a question here.
Christine Berli from the ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross. It's me, I'm here.
Oh, there you are.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this interesting lecture, Professor Pinker. You said in your looking in the future that we will learn to see that it's more intelligent to renounce on violence because the other one will renounce afterwards also on violence against us. The international humanitarian law, IHL, is built on the basis of reciprocity. I mean, this is the basic idea. But what we see now in the wars we work in is that the reciprocity is not so much of interest. I mean, the international humanitarian law is violated daily in the conflicts we see. Also, suicide bombings. People are not interested in the reciprocity in this sense. So how does this go together with what you are saying?
Well, basically what you're saying is the people who are not interested in these norms commit the violence, and because you've selected them precisely because they have rejected that norm. I'm talking about a global trend and a global norms agreement. That is what the international community embraces as an aspiration, what you see in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what you see in the stated intentions of countries, what you see in the aims of NGOs. So it's not to say that this is going to vanish overnight. And clearly, if you concentrate on the parts of the world that continue to be violent, those exactly are the people who violate this norm. So it doesn't say anything one way or another as to whether the world accepts this norm, other than the fact that not all the world yet does. Even then, many of those norms themselves are recent in human history, and in the past, as every history of genocide that I have seen says that basically in the past, all wars were genocidal. That is, that was just what you did. They didn't call it genocide because they didn't have the word. But when you read in history of, say, the sacking of a city, that sounds pretty neutral, like, they're just throwing a bunch of things around. But that's kind of a euphemism for genocide, and de facto that's what it was. Likewise, a siege. We know from World War II in the Soviet Union that a siege could mean hundreds of thousands or millions of deaths. But sieges are kind of, history students read about them, and the thing is that history books, until recently, until we've had organizations like yours, which concentrate on the human victims of war, it was kind of, empires rise, empires fall, there's a siege here, there's a sacking there, and you're not even told, oh, by the way, when there's a siege, that means several 100,000 people are killed. So that's the difference that I'm referring to. And I do think that it is a global trend, although you're correct that it's not a universal one.
Okay, there's Joachim.
Yes, well, thank you for a fascinating lecture. I was wondering if, especially the recent past, exhibits what economists would call a peso problem. And what we mean by peso problem, what we mean is that the history that we do see is only one realization of the histories that could have happened. And one of the reasons why there was so little interstate conflict, for example, in the last 50 years, is the shadow of nuclear war. It's deterrence. And we know that, for example, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but in many other instances, we got within an epsilon of millions of people incinerated as a result of thermonuclear war. So especially when we want to understand how the future looks, we want to think about the data generating process, of which the past only gives us one realization. And we're not that certain that this can never happen. There's still thousands of nuclear weapons around. There's biological and chemical weapons that terrorist organizations and increasingly states have weaponized. So I wonder how much of your optimism is actually justified given the increasing availability of weapons of mass destruction, and how close we've gotten to actually seeing these used in the not too distant past.
Yeah. Well, I certainly would not claim and did not claim that a future catastrophe is impossible. I mean, no sane person could claim that. There's just no basis for knowing that. So it absolutely is possible. Whether the world came within an epsilon in 1962 is actually debatable, and a number of historians going over the transcripts have suggested that it was too dangerous for us to feel comfortable about, but that it wasn't just a whisker away, and that both Khrushchev and Kennedy were in control, committed to not allowing it to escalate. It still could have escalated, but I don't think it was a whisker away, although it was much closer than it has been since then, and there have been improvements. So yes, I think we should be very concerned about those worst-case scenarios. I think there has been some progress in the reduction in the number of nuclear weapons by 80%. In the safeguards, some of the safeguards still not nearly enough, but since the Able Archer incident in the early 1980s, which was the closest that we've been recently. In the non-proliferation norms and the process that we just saw in Iran. So not to say that one ought to be an optimist about it, but just that, there are ways to continually reduce the risk. We know that the leaders of both the United States and Russia committed to eventual abolition of nuclear weapons, a process that then got derailed because of the tensions of the last few years. So in response to at least the argument that since the probability is non-zero, if you iterate it long enough, it becomes certain that it'll be used. I think that just as a mathematical argument is not sound, because if the safeguards do increase, if there is eventually an abolition, as many leaders have committed themselves to, then it could be that the probability of a nuclear weapon being used decreases faster than the iteration of the number of years in which they could be used. Chemical weapons, I don't think, are likely to reverse this because they're not terribly effective weapons of war. Biological weapons in practice also are not terribly destructive. There are kind of doomsday scenarios that we ought to protect against, but I don't think that they are threats of the same order of magnitude as nuclear weapons, which clearly do deserve more of the world's attention. And by the way, just in terms of the alternative, the peso problem, I'd never heard that term. But of course, it is true that we've only had one world, and so we do have a data point of the actual trajectory of a sample of one in a universe of possibilities. And there's no way around it other than by doing our best to assess trends and to see what the factors are that, as best we can guess, seem to be pushing the odds up or down. I tend to think that the world has seen some episodes of good luck, such as the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and some episodes of bad luck, such as getting into the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was entirely avoidable, and the tremendous bad luck of, for example, Hitler not being successfully assassinated or gassed in the trenches of World War I, where the world really caught a really unlucky break then, and history could have unfolded dramatically differently if that one contingent event had been differently. So you have to, in even considering alternative scenarios, they go both ways.
Yep. You have 3, 4 more questions right now.
Me?
Well, 5, 6, yeah.
Okay. I was interested that you spoke about animals, but you didn't include them in your forecast at the end. How much do you think they really fit into your paradigm? Because, there is a lot of violence towards animals, not just in hunting like you mainly focused on, but in our consumption of them. it doesn't seem like they really fit into the democracy paradigm because they don't have a voice, but maybe there's comparisons can be made with slavery. So if you could just make some points on that.
So a couple of questions there. Well, that is, are there national and global trends? There has been, as I mentioned, and I showed some data, there has been an increase in vegetarianism. Although even in countries like the United States and England, the rate of vegetarianism is still pretty low. It's between 3% and 7%, despite the fact that it seems that everyone knows a lot of vegetarians, but everyone seems to know the same vegetarians because there really aren't that many of them. What I think we'll see is increased protection of the welfare of farm animals. We've certainly seen that both in the European Union and in the United States, where there are regulations on how swine and chicken can be treated. I think we'll see, I'm not a vegetarian, but I am a reducitarian. That is, I eat less meat than I used to, and that does appear to be at least a Western trend, although it might be reversed by the rest of the world as they develop a taste for meat and can start to afford it. But the concern for the welfare of animals, I think, will certainly increase. The problem with animal welfare, especially when it comes to farm animals, is that you have two trends going in opposite directions. You've got the moral trend to be more concerned with the welfare of animals. And you're right that that has nothing to do with democracy, with commerce. It's a nice example because it's purely moral. The animals have no say whatsoever. Any concern with animals is sheerly because of moral arguments, empathy, or philosophical arguments against exploitation of animals. But against that trend, you also have the trend of making more and more meat more and more affordable to more people, what's sometimes called the broiler chicken revolution. Namely, that chicken used to be a luxury. It's a sign of progress in one sense that poor people can afford chicken, but not from the point of view of the chickens. And so the worldwide trajectory for how we treat animals, I think, will depend on how those two curves interact.
There's a question here, over there.
Yes. Hello, I really enjoyed your talk. Maybe I missed something, but in the section of your talk on the future of violence, I didn't see any references to climate change. And I'm wondering whether you think that climate change will be an important source of violence in the future, and if so, what kinds of violence might it cause?
It's enough in the future that I didn't feel comfortable predicting one way or another, because much of it depends on how much the world actually mitigates climate change. We heard from Ted Miguel earlier this afternoon. There's some evidence that climate stress in the form of hot and dry temperatures can be a risk factor for violence. Although I think a lot of those predictors, I think the evidence is much stronger for local violence, intercommunal violence, crime. We heard about witchcraft persecutions. When it comes to organized violence at the level of states, there, I'm not sure Ted might disagree, but the evidence is a little iffier. And the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, for example, insists that there's little to no connection. This doesn't mean that we should at all be complacent about climate change, which could cause a great deal of human misery in the form of starvation and migration and so on. But for organized violence, you need some powerful organization that decides to fight a war. And most wars for many decades have not been fought over resource shortages or local climate stress, but over security, grievances, ideology, mutual fear, righting historical wrongs, holy places, and so on. I mean, that would be a talk in itself, because I know that most people believe that wars are fought over resources, although I think the evidence is that most of them are not. But anyway, a complicated story.
Professor, thank you very much for the most fascinating and brilliant lecture. I have one question. The world since 1940s, as you have described, is living in a growingly new reality. Previously, the humanity has been formed by several factors, including fear of death, of violent death, and fear of hunger. And now, both are declining very rapidly. But what would humans look like in 20 or 30 years Because how would that influence, I mean, the human mentality? What will be us like in the future years? Because the world is becoming better. Would we become better, or would we change? How?
Yes. Well, biologically, we won't change, at least genetically, we won't change in 20 or 30 years, just because that's the order of a generation, and the process of Darwinian evolution is measured in time steps of a generation. We'll probably, this is a very optimistic viewpoint. If all of these indicators continue to improve, then we may all look like the Swiss. That is, well-fed, well-educated, and and pretty peaceable. That is, not fighting a whole lot of wars, not having a whole lot of crime. So that's the, when people say, "Is this utopian? Is it romantic?" And I think, well, if more and more of the world looked more and more like Switzerland, I could live with that.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Pinker. I really appreciate your optimism. And I would like to know whether you agree with those who claim that these new forms of asymmetric warfare and Islamic terrorism constitute a whole new quality and dimension of violence that have never been seen in history before.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's true. Certainly not true by the numbers. Terrorism. Well, I'll separate out just one scenario, and that is nuclear terrorism, and that's hypothetical. That could be that could have a big impact on numbers. But there have been, in 2010, there was a global agreement that worked toward the lockdown of weapons and fissile material. I don't think that it's highly likely that we'll see terrorists getting their hands on a bomb. Maybe I'm an optimist, but I think that the paths toward that happening have been delineated, and the world, since it's in the interests of so many powerful parties in the world, that including all of the nuclear states who have no particular interest in nukes being out of their control, then I don't think that that's the kind of certainty that it was predicted even just 5 or 10 years ago. In terms of the rest of the asymmetric warfare, the numbers just show that those don't kill nearly as many people as the old-fashioned wars of the proxy wars that were a result of the Cold War from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, to say nothing of the old-fashioned interstate wars like Iran, Iraq, or Korea or Vietnam. That is, that terrorists can cause a lot of fear. In zones of anarchy, which we have, the West has inadvertently created in in Iraq, there can be a great deal of human suffering. It certainly requires a different kind of planning and a different kind of military than the one that most Western governments have had in the past. So it does involve a rethinking of strategy from the kind of Cold War weaponry and Cold War games that the United States has been playing. But other than the separate nuclear terrorist scenario, I don't think it's can bring the numbers back up to what they used to be.
So we have now here the next question, and then in the back.
Professor Pinker, my name is Cesar de la Cruz, and I have a question for you related to the sector of finance. First of all, thanks for the fascinating lecture. On your lecture, you mentioned that the growing infrastructure of commerce in the past contributed to peacemaking. My question is, what can capital markets do in the future to continue with the reduction of violence? What can we do of market makers?
Yeah, well, I'm just going to riff here because I haven't really, I don't think I have a particularly well-formed opinion. One of them would be try to minimize the possibility of the low probability, high impact catastrophes, the global recessions, global depressions. That if the system could be made more robust to those very bad case scenarios, that would be a start. Just because if there's enough of a crisis, then it's just hard to predict what would happen. So that would be number one. Number two is to measures that would increase economic growth in the developing world, such as if there are tariffs that disadvantage the developing world in global markets. It would seem to be pretty obvious to try to reduce those. Facilitate the transfer of technology that can improve people's lives to the developing world, such as genetically modified organisms that are drought resistant and pest resistant and high yield. Low carbon forms of energy, including new generations of nuclear reactors that would produce less waste. I think nuclear has to be part of the equation for decarbonization of the world's economy. Now, that isn't so much finance, I guess, as just more international relations generally. But I think anything that would improve economic growth in the developing world would very likely have a pacifying effect. That in all of the statistical literature on predictors of that try to run through the alternative scenarios to try to predict what would happen based on what we already know, probably the most robust is that at the lowest end, economic development drastically reduces the chance of civil war. It's a relationship that levels off after, I think, about maybe $1,000 or $1,500 per capita GDP, but it's very steep at the low end. And nowadays, it's often the poorest countries that are most likely to have civil wars. So whatever would help that would have the biggest effect, whatever help lifting up the poorest.
Two more questions. Thank you. I have a question after the events of last Friday. You mentioned Iraq before and terrorist incidents in Iraq. Obviously, people simply cannot go there and thereby avoid violence. But on the other hand, there are instances like last Friday or 9/11, which are completely unpredictable. People can choose not to go to Iraq, but people will always choose to go to New York and Paris. So my question is there any way statistically to measure unpredictable violence that hits whenever, wherever, where it wasn't expected at all? And hasn't that gone up in the recent past?
It's hard to say because terrorism is one category for which we don't have very good time series data. I mean, I did my best in the Better Angels in piecing together a number of data sets from overlapping periods. But it's actually not that clear that people in England, in the UK, for example, lived in the threat of violence anywhere, anytime during the Troubles. In Europe, there was the Red Brigades, the Baader-Meinhof Gang, many others. The United States had the Black Liberation Army, the Symbionese Liberation Army, the Weathermen, and so on. So if you actually look outside of the zones like Iraq, where terrorism shades into insurrection and civil war, it's not completely obvious that the risk to a typical citizen of terrorism has increased. And even if it has, as the terrorism panel emphasized, and it seems callous to keep pointing this out, but that you're almost, if you live in outside of a war zone, you're almost certainly going to die of something else. You are as likely to die of a terrorist attack as to be hit by lightning, to drown in a swimming pool, and in fact, the biggest increase in deaths as a result of 9/11 came from the fact, other than the event itself and of course the events in Iraq and Afghanistan, but for an American, the big risk of death was that people avoided planes and they started driving, and so they were more likely to be killed in car accidents. It's been estimated that in the year after 9/11, there were 1,500 excess deaths from people avoiding airlines, air travel. So the imperative in both the ability to lead normal lives in the face of terrorism, and for that matter in combating terrorism itself, because terrorism is in the publicity business. That's almost by definition what terrorism consists of, is I think to have people have a better statistical appreciation of what a small risk it actually is. And a statistically more literate population would be less terrorized by terrorism, in turn reducing its effectiveness, and would probably make a lot of better decisions as to how to combat terrorism, namely, how much are we giving up, especially when it comes to, or how many deaths are we causing when it comes to extreme responses like overseas invasions compared to the actual risk of terrorism.
Thank you for the good message that the violence has been reduced substantially in the past of centuries and in the course of time.
Where am I looking? I'm sorry.
That's a good message.
Okay,
yeah,
yes.
That's a very good message.
Yes.
Message that we have reduced violence. On the other side, what does not make me feel really good is that this violence, even if reduced, is at my doorstep. or coming closer to us here. I don't want to say the Paris, but it's Paris, it's the Ukraine, it's the Middle East, it used to be Yugoslavia. That's one trend. And the other thing is that, could you say something about the potential of violence in the trends which are not yet solved, like the climate problems, that violence could result from this? We could have the fight for resources, diminishing resources. That could be a source of violence. And the last one is Paul Kennedy, war of cultures.
Okay, so let me go through them in turn. Violence is not coming closer to us. In fact, the zone of war has been shrinking. Ukraine was a counterexample to that. But I mean, even in Europe, to say nothing of the entire history of Europe until 1945, where, as I mentioned, there were 2 new wars a year for 600 years. But even in the post-war years, there were wars in Hungary, there was the invasion of Czechoslovakia, there was the Greek Civil War, which killed 150,000 people. There was plenty of violence in earlier decades, and the zone of war has pretty much been shrinking to an arc from Central and Sub-Saharan Africa through the Middle East into Pakistan. That's where the violence is concentrated. So Europe really is the safest place you can be. I would not worry about being in Europe, despite the terrorist attacks. And again, the risk of death from homicide is higher than the risk of death from terrorism. So violence coming to your doorstep is often the hoodlum or the home robber or the carjacker rather than the terrorist. In terms of the future, well, I already mentioned that the relationship of climate change to organized war is not completely clear, although it is one of many reasons to combat climate change. And I'm not predicting that we will successfully mitigate climate change, although I think we could do so if there was a combination of carbon pricing and massive R&D in low-carbon technologies, including solar, carbon capture, and nuclear. In terms of resource shortages, I do think that is probably a red herring, because first of all, I don't think there are going to be major resource shortages, just for the standard economic reasons that as a resource becomes scarcer, it becomes more expensive, and it gives people an incentive to conserve or to find alternative sources. Water is the big exception to that, and of course that's related to climate change because you can't find a substitute for water. But if I can be a little bit of a visionary, even water, if we had a, which is entirely feasible, within 30 or 40 years, inexpensive, safe, new generation of nuclear power. You can use nuclear power to desalinate seawater anywhere, and so even in principle, the water problem could be dealt with given the right technological improvements. So looking out 30 or 40 years, we know that if we do nothing, that climate change will be a very severe problem. But we also know that we don't have to do nothing, that there are things that, and in fact, all of the moral and rhetorical energy that's now expended toward kind of lamenting our doom and prophesying a dark future, if we applied it, I think, like good economists, to figure out what are the paths that the world could take that would avoid this catastrophe, that I think the world would be a better place. I think these are horrendous problems. I also think that they are, in principle, solvable problems.
So thank you very much for inviting us.
Thank you.